Hello, everyone. So welcome to the Headless Creator course on choosing content management systems and particularly composable content management systems. So I'm your host, Mark Demany, and I am really fortunate to have a guest, Tim Bennix. We are
Hello.
both from Uniform, and what we're going to do today is really kind of set up a bunch of lessons, and we'll talk through what's in our composable CMS guide and really spend a lot of time kind of talking about some of the thinking behind the criteria that we came up with. And so for today's lesson, what we're going to do is really kind of introduce the guide, where you can download it. So you can actually click on this QR code or visit uniform.dev and go to our resources section to download that. You will see a gated form here. You can fill out your information and download it. And once you get to that guide, you will see that it is a PDF with a lot of content. You can see it's a 63-page document. We really talk about things in detail down to pricing model, content modeling capabilities, all sorts of other functional and non-functional criteria. And what we'll be doing through this series is talking through each of these things in depth. And so today, really, we're going to introduce why we thought it made sense to write the guide. And Tim and I, we've both been in the industry for a really long time and have a lot of experience on the customer side, on the agency side, and on the vendor side. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of lack of understanding, particularly around headless and composable. And we thought by writing this guide, it would help bring a lot more clarity and understanding about what some of the terms are, what some of the table stakes functions are, and really what some of the value proposition of headless is. Because a lot of people who are new to headless are coming from other systems like Adobe AEM or Sitecore or WordPress, and they're very different in terms of what they offer and how they offer it. And so, that's really the thinking of why we wanted to do this as a vendor and really provide some more understanding there. So I've been talking for a little while. Tim, when I first wrote this, you said if you had this when you were at an agency, it would have saved you so much time up front, working with clients. And what can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Because what we've noticed is that it's like having a lot of choice is just really hard sometimes because there's so much you can choose from with all different kind of feature sets and then what fits you. And what we saw all the time is that you have a few stakeholders that have high opinions on stuff and others that didn't really have specific opinions but did have business issues to solve, right? And then these people with these opinions on certain pieces of software or best of breed or whatever you want to call it, they at one point called the shots and just chose what they liked and that it would never really fit. And so between people like you and I and also us at the agency, we kind of understand how everything fits together as a puzzle. It's all like little components that together become a beautiful thing, right? But that's not exactly normal when you come from another place, when you come from more of a monolithical approach to stuff. Because then it's all lovely and all in one box and you can oversee it kind of, right? And so it's always just really challenging to understand which puzzle pieces actually solve your business problems, because there's a gap between what does the business need and what can this technically do for me. And so if I had a guide like this, I could first of all show it to all my colleagues and say, all right, everyone, these are all basically all the checkboxes of what all these features are in these systems. Do they actually solve what we have to solve for this particular customer or not? And generally, like, of course, there's a bit of overlap between all these, right? But generally, they didn't solve things, but we just went with the opinion of the person shouting the loudest and doing the best pitch. And I think a document like this kind of balances out things a little bit more. You can objectively put things next to each other. And I actually haven't seen a document like this. So have you had any sort of examples of this, Mark, when you were working maybe even on the vendor side.
Oh, definitely. I mean, often to your point, it's really one function that's driving things. And I think that was part of what I wanted to do in this document, was really not just look at features, but also say, these are the features that certain functions care about. So as you were talking about that, it made me bring up the document again. And for each of the functional criteria, we're basically saying, okay, what roles are interested in this, and who are the stakeholders? And you can see here there's 7 groups of stakeholders. And I think that's one of the things that is really important, is to say, it's not just marketing versus IT, and then one group owns it and the other group implements it, or vice versa, or IT owns it and forces marketing to use it. You really have to do take a step back and say, these are all the tasks that you're trying to accomplish, and these are the stakeholders, and these are the roles, and make sure that each of those has a role in the evaluation process, because otherwise you may pick something that's going to fit your role and then put it in front of somebody else and it doesn't at all fit their role, and you get a massive disconnect. And I think to the second part of your question, we would definitely see this on the headless CMS side. Implementing a headless CMS, and the developers would love it. It was fast. It was SaaS. The authoring experience was very snappy and quick. But marketers were lost. Like, how do I make pages? How do I handle an organizational structure? How do I build a landing page? Like, what do I need to do? And, in a lot of cases, Headless CMS can do some customization for authoring experience. Some can, some can't. That's something we can dive into. I think we have a live stream just on content authoring and authoring experience coming up. But even those that can customize that, often that ends up being the last thing in the project, and usually the first thing that's dropped. You're focusing purely on that external customer experience, and if you ignore the internal customer experience, your content creation pipeline will suffer and seize up because of that. So that's all that to say, yes, that's you see a lot of that. For sure.
It's interesting to see that, and I've learned this only relatively recently after having not worked at an agency for a while, is that the team buy-in actually has the most success for most companies. Looking back now, because when I was at an agency, of course you're into the deliver the best product, right? You make the best commerce platform with the best design, with the loveliest animations, all that stuff, right? So you're very production driven, and that works pretty well as an agency who doesn't have like this super global reach, that wouldn't do like business transformation, but more just, you're more of like a studio. You just build something great. And I've been at that for a long time. And then later on in my career, and even now, you're looking back at process, like that everybody actually partakes in this process. And then suddenly things that I never considered became even more important for success than I thought. For example, I recently saw, I think it was maybe a Mac Alliance presentation or somebody showing whatever they did with like composability. And the outcome of what they had built, the actual production, wasn't that good. Like I looked at it, it's like, okay, your Lighthouse score is like in the 50s. This is not fast at all. And it's very clunky. Why is this not what I expect when you do a presentation? Turns out I was only looking at the production value. But if you also look at the process, they gained like, I don't know, 1,000% in awesomeness on their process side. So they actually had the win by saying, if somebody asked for a feature, let's say the CEO needed a wish list, rather than saying maybe in 6 months we could fit it in, they could say, do you want it this week or next? And then it had to, like we say in Dutch, like the dime has to drop. And then suddenly you understand that I had that moment like, oh, wait, even though the website kind of sucked, all the rest became amazing. And so then you have time to make your website awesome by just hiring the right people and putting them in the right place. And so for me, it's interesting to see. And so just choosing a CMS is not a technical adventure. It's not a DevOps adventure. It's for everyone. And so But of course, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say I agree completely. And the one thing that I had seen, for many, many years is basically a content management system accelerates. It's kind of like being drunk. It accelerates whatever your organization already is. If your
Mm.
process is really well defined, a CMS will accelerate that. If your processes are not well defined, a CMS project will actually make that worse. And I did see this I've seen this at an organization I worked at, and I've also seen this at companies implementing CMS systems where instead of trying to take things and be modular and chunk things up into areas that make sense, and again, involving those stakeholders, they took what they had currently and they tried to re-implement everything. And so the project was huge.
Yeah.
It didn't play to the strengths of the system. It didn't allow them to step back and do any organizational transformation to make the tool better and easier. And so at the end of it, they were probably in a worse position than they were at the beginning.
Yeah, there you go.
Because they've spent all this money, they've done all this change management, trying, or not change management, changing. They didn't do change management. They just changed systems, and it made it a lot worse. But to your point, I've seen other organizations using tools that weren't as great. I've had to use a lot of very old CMSs in my day, going back to Interwoven TeamSite, and that was a hard CMS to work with, especially compared to modern tools. But we were able to make it work for the organization, and put processes in place to minimize having to impact and do work on the CMS. And so, yeah, it just kind of accelerates what your organization is already doing and what their characteristics are. Yeah.
What's really interesting to me is that you just said like it has to work for your organization, right? Because in my career, I've had like back to back two huge customers where we had like large scale and they were actually relatively mature in their process. And for the one of those large ones, that was probably the biggest project of my career when we probably made like 800 tenants of websites over multiple brands, all different languages and all that stuff. And they were a brand that was quite decentralized. So they really needed a CMS system where the people in the countries would go in and change stuff every day. They were like full on changes, design, new campaigns, all of that. And so when you build a project like that with the customer, you grow into it and it takes a few years, right? And so for them, this was the perfect setup. And so they had a CMS. In this case, I think it was with Sitecore, and they had like their design in like experience manager, experience editor. I think that's what it was called, and it worked really well for them. And so then I went to the next customer that I won't name because it was not allowed, but I would go into a mindset to a customer like that and say, and look at their architecture, look at their design choices, and then the CMS they had chosen, and I could not fathom why they did it so differently. Turns out it has to work for your organization. They did not want any content editor ever to touch a page design because the president of the company had decided this is how this page looked because they spent half a year on the design of that page. They essentially made posters that were responsive and looked extremely good. And you're not allowed as a measly content editor to touch anything. You just have approved content to put together. And so this whole authoring experience is very different. They literally had 4 people full-time working, ordering search results because these shoes cannot be next to that bag. That's where that's where they put the effort in their process. And then the CMS was literally just putting it together. There was hardly a CMS at all. It was more of a middleware code layer where we just connected stuff so the front end could show something. And so they have completely different needs for composable stuff than that first customer that really needed like everything on the page, not going out of your browser tab and just dragging and dropping, right? And a lot of people don't realize that there's just very different needs.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to point that out, and it's kind of related to the overall purpose of this project and creating this guide. You often hear like, why are there 20, 30 content management systems out there compared to other markets, like say databases or CRM software, where you
like
have
3.
one or three, and like, why is CMS so special that there's 30 vendors? And
I think
to your point, it's what I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is there are a lot of different kind of angles that you can take to it, some of which have
Yep.
changed a little bit, but back in the day, programming language used to really influence it. Were
Yep.
you a Java CMS? Were you a .NET CMS? Were you a
Yep.
PHP CMS? If you had that organizational skill set, then you would want to pick something aligned with that.
Exactly.
That's
I'm happy
less
we're
the case
past that
now.
now, by the way. That's nice.
Well, we're a little past that now. It's React or
Yeah,
Next
but that's not really the
JS.
CMS, right? It's just how you connect to it, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
But there's still new CMSs coming out. I had an email from a lovely CMS from Germany like a week ago. If I wanted to make a video on them, it's like, did you literally make another CMS from scratch? Did you actually put money in that? And they're like, yeah, we were an agency and we saw this specific use case and no CMS had it. So we just built our own CMS and it's excellent. But it's like the main thing they had to add on top was just multi-tenancy, right? So they had to be able to change organizations fast and add 20 websites in one team and 10 in another, and then switch between these and copy content, because they just had all these multi-tenant projects. Yeah. And apparently, well, if you ask Contentful for multi-space, they start crying, right? So there are needs here and there. So I alluded to our document for a second. But yes, we'll do that later. But it's interesting to see that there still are use cases, and I was completely surprised. And it's a lovely CMS.
Yeah, no. So back to that point, there are different use cases, there are different geographies, there are different philosophies on things like content sharing and multi-tenancy and localization. And so within all of these, you sort of have a matrix of what amount of each of these things each CMS has. So I think that's a great segue to go back to the document for a moment here.
Yes.
And I'll share that. So really quickly here, again, trying to convince you that this is worth downloading. We'll talk through a few of the sections here. So chapter 1 is kind of what we're doing in this session, a little bit of an introduction to the topic of content management systems, and particularly composable content management systems. As we were discussing, we were talking about process and teams, and rather than just writing a guide that's a list of functional criteria, we really wanted to talk through topics like background analysis and planning and really how to keep those stakeholders involved in order to have your selection process and implementation be more successful. Little bit of advice for meeting strategic goals, and including what pitfalls and anti-patterns to avoid. That will be another session unto itself later on. And then, of course, the vendor evaluation itself. This is probably the meat of what you'd expect. So it's really looking at non-functional criteria. So, evaluating the vendor for things like partner network, geographical footprint, community, documentation, et cetera, et cetera. So all the things not related to the product features itself. But again, this will be another full session in a later on live stream. And then, of course, the functional criteria. So this is really where we can go through each criteria and kind of talk through what we see as table stakes, and what baseline capability for certain things are, and then what some of those advanced capabilities are. And I think one of the things that it's really, again, important to point out when we talk about the right CMS for the right use case, in a lot of cases for advanced capabilities, you will be paying for that. So I think it really is important to understand, do you actually need this or not? Because you will go through a lot of evaluations and even a number of vendor demos, and certain things that look cool may not be necessarily related to what you actually need to accomplish. To Tim's earlier point about that, site that didn't look that great, but it was definitely accomplishing their needs, right? And exactly. So, I think it's important for each of these capabilities to look at it understand it in the needs of the context of your stakeholder and go from there. So
Yeah, and I really
that's
enjoy like the pricing models and stuff because you can see
yeah.
how different CMSs attack that in a different way, right? Sometimes it's like upsell of just more users or something, and then others
Mhm.
say, well, if you have more content type and you have to connect them, let you can pay on that. So they have very interesting models on what it means to scale and then make money. They're all
Yeah.
really quite different here.
Yeah, and it's again to the point of use case. Um, Depending upon your use case, let's say it is multinational and multi-regional, and you have the same amount of content, vendor A will charge you a lot more because that's one of their pricing levers, and vendor B may not charge you as much because you may be able to take that content and share it amongst different brands and organizational structures. So the answer to everything is it depends, but at least something
I
like
love
this
that.
will help you navigate how different vendors think about pricing models. So
Exactly.
let's see here. The last thing we want to do in the few minutes that we have left is really just cover some of the topics. We've been talking about a lot of terms, CMS, DXP, DXC. We do have at the start of the document a little bit of a section on what some of the terms are. I think it'd be useful really for us to talk about what we mean by composable and what we mean by headless, because I think this is one of the things that certainly for an intro conversation is worth talking about, because this is kind of the source of the original confusion that we were seeing in that market is like, what are these things? And so I think, Tim, why don't we talk about the difference between CMS, DXP, and DXC?
Whoa, that's a good one. You want me to just give it a try? Because
Yeah,
it might like, of course, the lovely folks at Gardner and Forrester have this written down. I hope at least. Not everybody can get that because it costs you a bit of cash. But let's say, so we want to do the difference between CMS, DXC, and DXP, right? Can I
Yes.
be highly opinionated, or is it more the average?
I'd say be highly opinionated.
Here we go. Okay. So, what I would say a CMS is, and this is a little bit how I personally see it.
Mm.
CMS is content management, right? It's a relatively wide ranging set of words of what it could do. But in my opinion, a CMS is where your domain data lives, as in the data that you will take with you throughout the career of your brand. And you might want to put that on a phone or on a television or on a website or wherever, any channel. And it should just sit there. And so if you have an events website, you model all your data for events in your CMS, which means venues, locations, addresses, dates, artists, all that stuff, right? You model that lovely in there and it stays in there because you can use it anywhere. So that's how simple a CMS should be. And of course, it has all these lovely workflows. Can I publish this or not? So in my personal opinion, a headless CMS or whatever a CMS is not how your website design looks.
Mhm.
Your website uses the data that's stored in a CMS, but maybe there's also data stored in an image repository somewhere, or there might be data about credit card payments, whatever, elsewhere, right? A CMS is just a source of a certain bit of data, and it's not designing how anything looks. It's just data. It's almost like an old school Rolodex that you just use, and there's data in there, and then you use that somewhere else. Anyway, so for me, that's a CMS.
I
Does that
think
make any
I
sense if I say it like that?
I would agree 90% with that definition, and
Mm.
I would agree 100% with that definition in the context of headless and composable.
Yes.
I think that last 10% is because you can look at a CMS that is not a headless CMS, and it would manage the front end and the presentation layer. And so,
That's very true.
but this also starts to bleed into DXP and digital experience platforms,
Exactly.
because
I'll go
those,
there in a sec. Exactly.
yeah,
Because you have
but
this. Sorry, go on.
you can have a CMS that's not necessarily a DXP, but all
Yes.
DXPs would have CMS capabilities. So
Yeah, that's exactly how it is. And there's also these lovely crossover platforms, like for example, something like Prismic. They have a headless CMS with a great API. It's really fast and it's cheap to use. But they have also added something like the slice machine, where content editors can almost visually build a page, where they focus a little bit more on how a page looks in the CMS rather than it's just data. And it's a great alternative for a lot of different projects. So they're crossing over more into like the visual builder stuff while still being a headless CMS. So let's move into DXP then, where, like you said, not all CMSs are DXPs, but all DXPs are also CMSs, I guess. So a DXP is generally seen by people as something that's monolithic. A lot of stuff sits in this one bucket and it does everything a little bit. And it's generally managed hosting, because I think that's just the moment we defined the word DXP, digital experience platforms, is when that was the way to do things, like the Adobes and the Epi servers. This is just the way that was running. And so essentially with a DXP, you have a CMS, but all the other things that matter for the experience of the end user and how to manage that are all in this. So they could have a personalization engine. They could have some sort of front end accelerator. They could have analytics tools. They could have big data related tools to see where people click, and then you make dashboards out of that. Or user data can be stored in them. There's lots of that stuff, like search is involved. So it's basically just everything the experience of a user, everything that defines the experience of the user, you just have in that one lovely tool. Does it make sense like that, Mark? I know you have a bit more experience there than me.
I think that does make sense, and that as you talk about these things, I think, oh, I should show this part of the document. I think,
Yeah.
yes, that's absolutely what a DXP in sort of that singular platform is, and there's kind of two definitions of DXP. One is where you buy that one thing from a single vendor, and then there's this other definition that I think is becoming more and more used with Composable, which is an organization will build a DXP and they will assemble that from a number of different sources. And so we're talking about composable content management, but we also have a chapter at the end of the document where we're talking about, okay, you're selecting a CMS, but what are the other things that you need to do that a DXP used to do? And this, so to your point, you're assembling all of those things from other sources and vendors. You need to know what you're doing for front-end rendering. You need to know what you're doing for search. You may have customer data. So this is one of the big shifts in that market is Composable allows you as a business to not just select your CMS that makes sense for your organization, but also select all those other things. And we don't go into all of those things, but we at least identify at a high level those other considerations that you need to kind of take into account because you're going to be fitting these things together.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, sorry to interrupt here, there's an in-between here now also, where traditional DXPs are actually going a little bit more granular with their feature sets right now by adding headless capabilities, for example, and then also opening up their systems a little bit more and then making it composable in their way, because they cannot just go full force composable and say this is what it is, and you have to kind of pick your battles and see which ones you integrate. Because if they do it that way, they go full force ahead headless, they will alienate 10 years of history of marketing and customers. So they cannot really do that. But what they can do is go in between, where in Sidecore and Adobe, you can do lovely headless approaches, and then you still have something composable, because you don't have to choose their content hub. You don't have to choose their data collection layer or their personalization, but you can. So there, inside the traditional DXP space, there's a lot of modernization going where you can still choose the puzzle pieces you want, but they're generally single vendor, but you don't have to pay for them. So there is a form of DXP that's composable. That's not exactly what we are talking about here, but it's still really interesting for customers that, let's say, have a 5-year agreement with a DXP like that they can actually still modernize and still do the cool things, but then within that same space.
So on the subject of modernization and doing cool things in composable, that brings us to the last definition we're talking about, which
Yes.
is DXCP, which is a digital experience composition platform. And do you want to take a crack at that, or do you want to
Okay, I'm
let
gonna
me do
give you
that?
one sentence. It's oh wait. I'm gonna give you two words to define it.
Yes.
Oh, I'm not sure I can do it. Let's say, okay, I'm just going to say it and see what it comes with. It's an agnostic DXP.
I think that's kind of what we were getting at.
That's like the
In
simplest I can make it, and I'm not sure it means anything to people, but maybe let's explore that a little.
Yeah, let's explore that a little. So, to be fair, this is the company that Tim and I both work for called Uniform, and we build a digital experience composition platform. And really, what it allows is a lot of those DXP type functions that marketers were used to, that developers were used to as well, in terms of aggregating things from different sources. But built in a way on modern composable approaches and built in a way that connects to and consumes content and data from composable vendors. So we're kind of trying to hit the best of both worlds, which is do those things that everybody needed and expected from previous generations of software, but without the architectural baggage.
Yeah, I think
Is
that
that
makes a lot of sense. And the interesting bit here is that while we were building this type of software towards this super composable DXP thing, is that due to the nature of that software, a lot of things just fell into place. I think it's like right time, right place, perfect moment with where the tech was evolved enough, where suddenly you're not exactly building a CMS or a data federation tool, but it's all we have the ability now to do something superficial where you could drag and drop stuff and attach external sources to it that didn't exist before. And just the nature of whatever that DXCP thing is changed the game. Because, for example, doing preview of what you're building is really hard when you have 5 different tools that all offer an SDK for preview, right? How do you do that? Well, you don't, because it makes no sense. And so suddenly that fell into place with the DXC. Or things like personalization. If you wanted to do that across your commerce engine and then into your, this is what that person bought, which is maybe in a CRM. And then maybe certain pieces of content come from an Algolia search. How do you personalize that without fully hard coding everything in? That's really messy, right? Due to the nature of how agnostically this was built, suddenly it just comes out of the box. It would be stupid if we didn't build these features in because they're so normal and relevant suddenly. So that it's really an exciting time for building this kind of thing. I went a bit off of the path there, sorry, but I just get excited by this stuff.
Yeah, no, it definitely is pretty interesting stuff, and there's a lot of things. We talk about this shift to headless, and a lot of what headless systems offer are great for developers, but there's certain things that are missing from the marketer side as far as management of navigation and structures and things like that. So there's a lot there as well. I don't want DXCP to hijack this intro. There's another session we'll have on that. But it kind of as we talk about headless, I would like to explore headless a little bit as well, because I think there's it's a term that I don't love it, because by its definition, it's sort of a negative of another term. The term headless comes along from the fact that content management systems used to do everything, and then it's sort of removed that front end. And so there's sort of this, it's defined by what it doesn't do rather than what it does do. So I think it's worth talking about headless, getting into the literal definition, but also the market definition, and then explore a little bit why headless and composable is interesting, because there are certain compromises, and the value proposition is a little bit different from what content management systems were in the past. So it's a pretty big topic, but I think it's worth exploring a little bit to help people understand as they're looking through this, and keep some of these concepts in mind.
Yeah.
So Tim, let's see here. Do you want to take a crack at the headless literal definition, and I can maybe talk a little bit about what people mean sort of unofficially when they think about headless?
Oh yeah, sure. So let's see because when I was full force ahead working in agencies, this headless thing came about, and this is like, I guess, 10 years ago or something. And so essentially what we were used to is that when you choose a CMS system of sorts, whatever you chose, it came with this whole framework of what it would mean that if you hit save on some data, how that would look on a page. And that's the traditional way of how we would see it. It's the same now. Even when you go to like a WordPress website, you can visually see what you put your theme on, and WordPress is the theme and the database. And it works really well. And especially now where they made it like super visual and they did cool things with that. The nature of doing it that way is that you're relatively forced to whatever they choose that is great for that CMS of whatever front end comes out. Right? So if they choose that to use a certain type of way of writing HTML combined with some other things that they feel like is the best for their CMS, that's what you're stuck with. And then if you wanted to change that, because the web moves so fast, a year after building a website, we realized, okay, this technology is not good for accessibility or SEO, any of those things, right? So you wanted to change it, but then you could, obviously, you can always customize things, but then you did an upgrade and everything would just break immediately, dead. And that's the drawback of having everything in one bit, especially for developers, right? And so then developers realized, if we wanted to make our own front end that we can choose to change every month, every 3 days if we wanted to, because that's what front end developers want to do. You want to use the best of the best at all times. And that's just the nature of people in development or in production to, like, can you imagine every time you make a new movie, you have better CGI, right? That's what you do with websites also. It just moves that way. And the only way to be able to choose that is to build tools into the front end to be able to connect to other places in a really easy way. And so that's I'm projecting it now from a developer's perspective, right? And so what had to happen is if you wanted to do something with this content, it had to come out in a way that two pieces of software could talk to each other, right? There needed to be some sort of way of a connection from that standalone front end towards whatever that CMS was outputting. And that's what was called an API, which is Application Programming Interface. That's also one of the things that is in the document here. And so what that meant was essentially they would see the CMS officially as the whole body. And then the head was the website that would come out. And so they chopped off the head. And the only thing that would come out is basically just the arteries and whatever you had to connect to be able to build your full project. And so literally what a headless CMS is whatever you had before without that integration of whatever the website looks like. So it's literally data in, data out, that's it. That's also why it's very abstract, right? If you have a form that you fill out and you don't know what comes out, and you don't know what happens when you hit publish, that's what a headless CMS is, essentially. Okay, that was a very long way of explaining it, but I think I hope that journey made a bit of sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does. And what I will say now is that pretty much every content management system of note now has headless interfaces. I
think, sorry to interrupt, that a lot of the legacy sites or legacy CMSs had the same thing. I can remember even in the days of Sitecore 6 that I could talk to it with code, right? It was XML or whatever came out, but it still worked, right? And there were so many things like you had WordPress in 2010 with a plugin that would just output whatever content was in it in JSON. So it has always existed. It was just never a feature, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the point where we kind of talk about the literal definition of headless and then kind of the market definition of headless. Because if you say, oh, they're a headless content management system, at this point, to Tim's point, every CMS system now is a headless content management system.
Yes.
That literal definition is you can deliver content in an agnostic fashion, ideally, to that can be consumed by any API. But there's this other understanding when people say, "Oh, I've switched to a headless CMS." What they usually mean is yes to that literal definition, but also it usually means it's something that is more modern, software as a service, supporting output in JSON, and also more typically than not API first. And I think it's worth discussing what API first means. Really what that means is you're not just managing your content in the system, but you can also, through APIs, you can also manage the system itself through APIs.
Mhm.
And I think
Yes.
this is really important to note in the context of the document that we've written, because there's so many things that systems do differently. And in some cases, things like content modeling, some systems you can only do content modeling through their visual interfaces. Other systems you can change content models through APIs. And this is very important for developers to source control those content models, to trigger other changes, builds, et cetera. And so, this is kind of part of the problem and frustration when people just say headless is, there's that literal definition, and then that the other stuff on top of it, API first, SaaS, et cetera. Some systems have those, some systems don't. Some systems are more modern, and so it's not a term that everybody agrees on. And so this is kind of one of the big lessons up front is when you're saying headless, what do you really mean by that? And more importantly, what does your organization want out of that?
Yeah.
Tim was talking about developers and working on front ends. There's a couple other things that I think are important when really thinking about headless and wanting to go down that route. Another big one is omni-channel. Tim was mentioning a lot of those older systems, you're building pages and websites. Headless also became more important because content could be going to phones, it could be going to kiosks, it could be being sent in emails. And so that omni-channel need for customer experience is pretty important there. And the other big thing that we're seeing as well is more headless systems are easier to evaluate and get started. I think that's a topic that's near and dear to Tim's heart, is how quickly can a developer get in and start to play and understand what that system does.
Oh, you're opening a can of worms here. Because there's
Yes.
but that's what's interesting. I won't go too long on it, but there's different models that these companies work on, right? You have the model where you literally you can use it for free, but just you have like a smaller account somehow. And you can use that for free for always and just do it self-service kind of thing. You just learn through the documentation and videos and stuff and just use it for small projects. And what really interesting about this is that a lot of developers would do that and then would later on tell their bosses, hey, that's a cool thing to use, so let's then buy it. And then they can do upsells, right? So that's like a bottom of the funnel kind of thing, or bottom up approach. And then a lot of other companies that are a little bit more enterprisey driven, they wouldn't do that because the tool might have too many options or it's too unclear what the real value is, unless you go through an enablement type of situation where they set up a whole sandbox for you, where you just go into like a lovely made bed, right? You go in and everything is there, and they give you like all these courses and help you out, and it's much more sales driven, right? Because the company would seek you out. It's like, you are the right person for this thing, let me show you. And so there's just different approaches here, and I've always been one to use the first one that I just mentioned, but it doesn't mean that the other one is not good. Like, you cannot, like, for example, if you wanted to try something like Amplience, it's a killer CMS. It has a lot of features. It's amazing. A lowly developer like me could not make an account and actually try it. But that's on purpose because it has so many things in it. They need to set you up in a sandbox and do the whole thing, and then you see the breath of awesome that comes out of a system like that, but you need help. And so I'm especially recently much more interested to see why did they chose a model like that, right? Yeah, it's once again a choice criteria.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a choice criteria, but again, it makes sense for who some of the stakeholders that are driving that evaluation is,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I'm gonna date myself a little bit, because back in the day I was using Interwoven TeamSite when I was at Business Objects, and actually even further than that, I was working with a company that integrated with CMSs, and so they said, "Hey, we're going to try to integrate with the CMS. Um, here's Vignette and here's Interwoven," and this was back in the day where manuals were printed, and they dropped the manuals on my desk, and Vignette's manuals were about this wide, and I said, okay, and then Interwovens were about this wide. I said, okay, I'll start with that one,
Exactly.
and that was literally the criteria. We built that first, and went with that, and
Oh,
I did
really?
work on
The thickness of the
Interwoven for.
manual was essentially just your decision.
Well, I only had time to go through one, right?
Yeah,
Even that thick, that was the smaller manual, but it was
it's
still the
crazy.
thickest. And so we built that, and we started selling and integrating with that, and that became, what I ended up doing for, the next how many years of my career? 6 years of my
Yeah,
career. I didn't have time to get to the other one.
yeah, exactly.
So,
Um,
you know,
what I wanted to add to this is one thing that's pretty important. Like we just talked about, like what is headless and what does the market think it is? Because
mm,
generally, like you just said, Mark, like you have these extras. Like, do you have full API coverage for everything? Also
yeah.
management, also mutations of your data, or generating API keys, all these things, right? And so, with that in mind, you should have a look probably at the Mac Alliance, because I'm part
Mm,
of the technical council, and we would be actually evaluating CMSs and agencies, for example, wanting to join the alliance. And we had this whole list of things that CMSs, for example, need to have to be able to join this Mac Alliance. And then suddenly you see how many facets actually need to exist in a product to be able to actually validate. And so API coverage is a thing. Are you cloud native or not? Or is it managed hosting? All those kind of things make a lot of pretty big difference. And so for the people in the US who might not know the Mac Alliance that much, this is actually a very interesting alliance to have a look at, because they're trying to define what kind of headless and composable tech is, and who gets to join and who doesn't get to join, for example. It's a pretty cool approach to kind of classifying what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we're here, I think it's worth just taking a look at this diagram, because I think it's a good
You might need to
representation
zoom a
of.
little.
Oh yeah, how do I don't know that
I think Command
let's see
plus
here.
on your keyboard would literally zoom this in.
There
There
we
we
go.
go.
Okay. So as I was saying, we're talking about all these elements and making sure that they have to work together. This is a good example of that, in really, how you're managing experience management or commerce, or personalizing on that data, or pulling media from other sources. And it's a pretty simplified diagram. We see more complex ones than this, but it does kind of indicate how these things should be talking to each other and working together, and how you're delivering that for your experience on the front end.
I'm actually really surprised and happy to see that DXC is actually on the top there before your front end. That's actually a relatively new addition, I think.
Yeah, and this is part of what I think is so exciting about being at Uniform, is that ability to work with all those API sources and compose these things, and then have a delivery in an agnostic front end. The other thing I think it's worth pointing out here is that definition of mock. So we talk about the mock alliance, and we mentioned a little bit about it. We talked about API first. We talked about cloud native SaaS. We talked about headless. We haven't talked about microservices. I don't know, Tim, if you want to talk about that very
Oh,
quickly.
that's too dangerous because everybody thinks it's something else. Like I've
That's
had a debate
fair enough.
online in like talking groups about just microservices and what it is, and after an hour we decided to just call it quits. I would say the simplest thing is if you need to manipulate some data somehow and there's no product for it, you just build it yourself. So you make a little endpoint that has an input and an output, and inside that something magical happens. And so a really good example of a microservice could be that, let's say you're selling cars. But then when you sell the car, part of it is lease because your boss will pay for that car. And then another
Mhm.
part is extra things that you want to put on top. Like I like nicer rims and I like a nice radio in my car, but that's not part of the lease plan. So you have to buy that yourself. So then you have two things you have to buy, right? One is the lease plan and one is the other accessories. So I'm just giving you a real life example of what I've had to build before. So what
Mhm.
we would do is we would actually go and make a checkout of the whole thing in Commerce Tools. Then we would have a microservice where that whole checkout would be sent, and it would split it up into two things and then send both to Commerce Tools back and then back to the interface of the website, where it now
Mhm.
made effectively two orders and it did something with that data. So it signified this is the extra, this is the least one. And so that's what the microservice did. Input, output, keep it simple, and it might give you a bit of data or it might just receive something and save something else. And I think that's how you could define it. But a lot of
Mhm.
people have different opinions. I just give you mine here.
Yeah, I think in the context of CMS, I think of microservices as APIs for discrete chunks of functionality. So,
Yeah,
we've been talking a lot about content management APIs, but certainly you should also have APIs for things like user management. And a really good example of that is, okay, you need to manage access rights within your CMS, but chances are you may have another corporate system that is controlling access rights.
yeah,
And so instead of having to define access rights to things in two places, your CMS should be able to say, yeah, what are the access rights in the groups coming from that corporate system, and I'm just going to reuse those. So this is a pretty complex example, and obviously you really only need that if you're at the enterprise level. But I think that's a good example of um, you know getting those bits of discrete functionality into the system, and making it so that you can reuse that stuff instead of duplicating those things.
exactly. I think one last thing I wanted to say on this graph is look at where CMS sits. It's only a
Mhm.
tiny piece of this whole Mac architecture of your composable system, right? And what people tend to see CMS now is as basically the big yellow line that says digital experience composition. CMS is actually a smaller puzzle piece in a bigger system. There's no center of the universe
Mhm.
in architectures anymore when you go composable. And I think that's a lesson I've had to learn myself. And now that I know about that, that it's actually more agnostic and decentralized, that's when the
Yeah.
power comes in. And that's why a graph like this actually works really, really well.
Yeah, no, it's definitely worth highlighting that, and certainly you see that more and more often these days. It CMS used to be the center of the DXP world, and now we see, if you're doing B2C retail, your commerce system is probably the center of your world, and your CMS augments that.
Yes,
Another example of that is if you're an airline rewards program, your customer data is probably the center of your world, and then your CMS augments that, and you may not even have commerce at all as part of those capabilities. And so, I think this is kind of the beauty of this model and approach is, you pick these things and you prioritize these things and you build around these things based upon what makes sense for your organization.
exactly. And a fun example is that my personal website, if you go to timbennix.dev, it's full of content, but no CMS at all. It is
Mm.
all just a DXC with uniform pointing to where my domain data lives. My YouTube videos live on YouTube. Why put them in the CMS? My blog
Yep.
post lives on dev.to. Why put them in the CMS? My conference talks live on Notion because I just have a little table where I put all my conference talks and links.
Mm.
And so it's very interesting to have a look at sometimes why do I have a CMS? Do I have it because I just have it because that's what in my brain? Or do I maybe need to look at if I really needed a CMS, why would I have it? right? And that makes it pretty interesting to see. Literally, my website is, you can, if you check it out, it's full of content. There's just no CMS controlling it. So that's the next step in what digital experience composition might give you. And I'm not saying here don't use a CMS. You probably have to. We're just talking about my personal side, but it's an interesting thought experiment at least.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very cool question and something to explore in future sessions.
Yes.
So yeah, we've been talking for 55 minutes just on intro
Holy
stuff.
moly. There you go.
Yeah. I think this bodes well, because I think as we dive into more of the topics in the future and on the lesson listing in Headless Creator, you should be able to see what those future live streams are. We'll be here the same time next week, talking about like the RFP process and the proof of concept process. So as we
exactly.
Dig further into that and what evaluation means. And particularly, to Tim's point about the fact that a lot of these vendors are much easier to get started. What does that mean for evaluations? In the past, evaluations used to be, you'd fill out a giant spreadsheet, you'd send it to vendors would fill out answers, you'd weight those and come back and get a short list and get a demo. And, this process would take 6 months and things are very different now. So I think that'll be a fun session to talk about next week, and we definitely look forward to that.
All right. I think that wraps it up.
We'll see you next week. Thanks again, Tim.
All right. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.